Welcome, dear horror writer, to this auspicious occasion. You've been invited here to witness and taste something life-changing and unique that the ghouls have been cooking up in the crypt. Now, they've asked me to read you out a list of rules for this dinner, just so that your meal goes down smoothly. So first, don't question the floating bits in the soup. It's a special ghoul seasoning. Second, the meat in the main course is chicken, regardless of the texture. Our chef just has a special grilling technique. And third, you will notice that the wine has a coppery tang to it. It's a special imported wine from Transylvania that the ghouls had picked up while they were on vacation, and they wanted to share it with you. So drink up. Now that that's out of the way, let's talk about cannibalism. Probably the biggest question surrounding cannibalism is why? Why do you want to consume another human being? Well, the act of cannibalism, regardless of how nauseating and revolting it might sound, it just isn't this black and white idea of a person eats a person. Cannibalism, while yes, it is technically about humans consuming other humans, but it actually symbolizes a lot of other things, from love to power to control, dominance, and of course, physical and emotional hunger. And it was and still is used as a last resort to starvation. And another thing that really interests me is just how fascinated we are with cannibalism. Like, hell, even over on TikTok, my cannibalism videos are some of the highest viewed videos that I have. So why is that? Well, because cannibalism is the ultimate taboo, and it's also shocking, which makes it impossible to look away from. It's kind of like a car crash. You just have to look at it. Cannibalism also cuts into the parts of the human nature that we don't really like to look at directly. When someone eats another person, every rule we live by gets tossed out the window. That's why I think it's so powerful as a narrative device, especially in horror, because it shows us how us humans can do unspeakable things. So as I was saying, a lot of psychology behind cannibalism is about power because, simply put, eating someone has the effect of turning a person into an object that you have complete control over. It's dominance in its purest form of wanting someone to belong to you forever. And the final nail in the coffin of having complete ownership over them is, yes, you guessed it, consuming them. And yes, it's disturbing, but it makes sense in the twisted logic of control. It's, if I eat you, you can't leave me. If you can't talk back, you can't escape. You're part of me now. But there's another side to this that's honestly even more unsettling, which is that sometimes cannibalistic impulses come from a place of love and affection. And what happens here is that some people feel such an intense love or attachment to someone that they want to keep that person completely and permanently. And the scary thing about this is just how strangely tender it can feel, because the act of this is like some twisted kind of closeness, like a need to keep someone so close to you that you cross every boundary imaginable because consuming this person feels like the only way to keep them. Now, another psychological factor at play here is identity, and cannibalism is grade A stuff for messing up the boundary between who you are and what someone else is, because when you eat someone, there's no more you and me, there's just me. And throughout history, some cultures believe that you could absorb someone else's strength or spirit by eating them, which we'll get into in the next section. So in horror, this idea turns into a fear of being changed by someone else. The eater becomes a mix of two people, and that blend can be pretty terrifying. Then we have survival cannibalism, which is going to come up a lot in this video, and this is where psychology gets brutal, because when someone is starving and every option for food is gone, a different part of their brain takes over because now they're in survival mode. People who have lived through this kind of situation describe it as like something foreign has woken up inside them, and it's just pure instinct taking over their impulses. There's no romance, no symbolism, no big emotional arc that they need to crawl through in order to survive. It's just the body demanding to live, and it'll do anything to try and survive. Then we have the group psychology angle, because for centuries, societies have used the act of cannibalism as a way to point the finger at the other, as a way to make certain people or groups seem dangerous, savage, or less than human. For example, European colonizers often falsely accuse indigenous peoples in the Americas, Africa, and the Pacific of cannibalism, and even exaggerated or invented stories to justify their conquest and exploitation of these groups of people. Rival groups or religious communities also use these types of accusations to assert their power or moral superiority, which over time, given all of this lying, hate, and fear-mongering, cannibalism became more about fear, control, and dominance rather than people munching on other people. And when it comes to modern storytelling, we see this metaphor taking the shape of cannibalism as being used as a way to explore how society can consume people, like fame, capitalism, peer pressure, the endless grind and hustle of work. All of these things can feel like the invisible teeth that are slowly gnawing away piece by tiny piece at our individuality and sanity. And the horrifying part about it all is just how normal this feeling has become. So if you decide to pick up the fork and knife and carve into your own cannibal story, before you take the first bite, think about the hunger, aka cannibalism, of your story and what it actually represents. Is it power, love, loneliness, revenge, survival, faith? Make sure you know what it is, because the choice of your source of hunger is going to change the tone of your story, because a character who chomps on humans because they're obsessed or love the taste of human flesh is going to feel completely different from someone who eats to keep the person they love as close to them as possible. And a ritualistic community that sacrifices people and then eats them is going to feel different from someone who's been driven to consume by just pure instinct. So you see how different hungers trigger different narratives? So that's why it's important that you establish what it is, because it's going to reveal something unique to your reader about the character and the world they live in, and also set up the stakes, tension, and dread of your story. And really, when you peel back the skin of cannibalism's stories and take a good look at what's underneath it, what you'll find is the thought festering through its body's veins that somewhere inside of us, under the right circumstances, something dangerous could wake up, and it's something they don't want to admit that's there. So during my research, it actually really surprised me just how many different forms of cannibalism there are. And of course, they all end in the same way of a person consuming another person, but the processes and reasons all vary. So let's boil them down. So first, let's look at exo, endo, and auto cannibalism, because these are the three main types that everything else is going to be based off of. So endo cannibalism is the practice of consuming someone that comes from your community, and this is usually done in the form of eating the remains of a newly deceased person. And opposite to that is exo cannibalism, which is consuming those from outside of your community, and this usually meant eating your enemies as a sign of their defeat. And lastly, auto cannibalism, or self-cannibalism, is the act of eating yourself. Now, the easiest way to differentiate exo and endo cannibalism is that exo cannibalism is usually associated with hostility, violence, contempt, and used as a celebration of or some kind of victory, like defeating your enemies and whatnot, while endo cannibalism is usually associated with rituals like the grieving process after the death of a tribe member, ensuring the souls of the dead make it into the bodies of the next generation, respect, honor, and so on. Now let's get into the more, I don't know the right word for it, niche types of cannibalism. So first, there's survival cannibalism, and this happens when people eat human flesh because there's no other way to stay alive. And this usually happens in moments of extreme desperation during famine, shipwrecks, sieges, or being in total isolation with no access to food. So this is where real events like the Donner Party or the Starving Time in Jamestown, which was an English colony in Virginia, where back in 1609 and 1610, the colonists experienced a brutal winter, which led to famine and cannibalism. We can also look at movies like The Road and Ravenous, which are both great examples of this idea. Then there's ritualistic cannibalism, and yes, this is the type of cannibalism that takes place in religious, spiritual, or magical contexts, where the act of eating flesh carries some kind of symbolic meaning. Sometimes it appears as endocannibalism, where people consume the remains of loved ones to honor them or keep their spirit close. Other times it appears as exocannibalism, where the flesh of enemies is eaten as a way to humiliate them or gain power. Then we have religious cannibalism, and this type of cannibalism happens inside a belief system, hence religious, where eating human flesh takes on a spiritual or cultural meaning instead of being done out of sheer desperation for survival. And as for in horror, we can look at films like The Green Inferno, which uses ritual cannibalism that comes from a specific indigenous group, while in The Wicker Man, we can see ritual sacrifice being used to show this community's belief system and how it can make the unthinkable feel righteous. And one of my favorites, Raw, gives us a modern take on cannibalism by turning cannibalistic hunger into something that's been passed down and inherited. Now, third is nutritional cannibalism, and this is the kind of like survival cannibalism, but it's not done because you're actively starving to death, but rather because you're looking for calories, protein, or you're just hungry and need something to eat regardless of what cultural rules say. And lastly, we have aggressive cannibalism, and this is where the cannibal as hunter trope comes in because this type of cannibalism comes from someone who hunts, kills, and eats other people, all because they want human flesh. Full stop, done. They want that human burger. Now, some researchers believed that with enough exposure to eating human meat, this can make you develop an appetite for it, which is where they believe that this type of cannibalism comes from. Other researchers see this kind of like a power move that the cannibal performs, like they have this instinct to dominate in the most intimate and violent way possible. And I say that the most famous example of aggressive cannibalism has to be Hannibal Lecter, who treats cannibalism like a gourmet hobby and a personal philosophy. And of course, we can't forget about our favorite cannibalistic families from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Hills Have Eyes that show this type of cannibalism off perfectly. Now, on to the next course. So when you're mixing up your cannibal story, the easiest way to come up with a plot is by establishing what kind of hunger you want your story to have, because the reason why someone chooses to eat another person is going to decide the emotional direction of your entire narrative, as I was explaining before. And once you define that why, then your tone, symbolism, and fear are all going to follow naturally after it. So let's look at some plots, and these are going to be a little bit of a repeat, but stay with me. First, we have survival cannibalism, and as I described earlier, this is where the characters are turning to cannibalism because it's either that or starving to death. And this is a narrative that's going to be slow, tragic, and inevitable, because usually people that get to this point where they're resorting to eating other people, they usually have been broken down, have had things taken away from them, or they've seen so much tragedy and have so much hopelessness that their morals are gone and all they care about now is their survival. And this is also an arc that can sit really heavy with us emotionally because out of all the types of cannibalism, this is the most realistic one that could actually happen to us. And we can see throughout history that this has actually happened numerous times, from the Donner Party to the Essex and the Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 in 1972. So use that sense of doom in your story and instinct battling mortality, because the thing about starvation is that it slowly warps your mind the hungrier and hungrier you get. It isn't just boom, I'm hungry, let's eat people. So because of that, this kind of horror is going to be a slow erosion of humanity as you force your reader to sit through a story of slow moral collapse and moral structure, the slow fading of civilized rules, and the slow decaying of self as every hour becomes heavier and heavier to bear for your character. Now, this kind of cannibalism story is also very psychological and suffocating because its whole premise revolves around essentially waiting for food, waiting to die, waiting to see those you love possibly die, and waiting to finally admit that your chance for survival has started outweighing the person that you once used to be and the morals that you used to have. And the most important thing to remember if you're going to write a survival cannibalism story is that you're writing about absence, the absence of food, the absence of choice, the absence of rescue, and the absence of the person they were before the hunger came to town. And also remember, the moment they decide to take the first bite of human flesh, that's not your story's climax. The decision to do so is. And one of the best films that shows survival cannibalism is the film Alive, which is about the Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 that crashed in the Andes in 1972. The survivors were rescued after 72 days, but they had resorted in desperation to eating those who had already died. And funny enough, for some reason in grade 12, my religion teacher made us watch this movie. Why? I don't know. Next is ritualistic or religious cannibalism, and this is my favorite type, which is a little bit of a weird thing to say, but this is where, again, the consumption of flesh is done for ritualistic or religious purposes, and the consumption of human flesh is a part of a spiritual, ceremonial, or social practice and not for survival. It can also involve consuming parts of a deceased family member or group member to absorb their qualities or guide their soul into the living, and it can also involve consuming enemies to gain their strength or reduce their power. So essentially, both forms turn the body into a vessel of meaning rather than food. So, as for the types of stories that are going to come out of this type of cannibalism, this is ritual sacrifice and overall ritual horror territory where rituals are going to be taken to their most extreme and are usually a part of some kind of cult or community. Now, with ritualistic and religious cannibalism stories, again, psychology is going to come into play here because you're dealing with belonging and belief, and those are two powerful factors for how people are going to behave and think. It shows the extraordinary lengths that people will go when their community tells them that something is sacred, and this type of cannibalism shows how far humans can go when the act of ritual or cannibalism is framed as traditional, duty, love, or all three. It explores devotion that's shifted into hunger, faith that has slipped into fanaticism, and identities so interwoven and tangled in ritual that their mortality collapses under the sheer pressure of what's expected of them. So as for the characters in this type of story, it's important to remember that those who participate in this kind of cannibalism often don't view themselves as violent or crazy whatsoever. Instead, they see themselves as loyal because, remember, we're dealing with cult psychology. And these people believe that by doing what they are doing, that they're upholding tradition, preserving culture, and are fulfilling a spiritual requirement to possibly reach a higher plane or speak to their god. As for the type of narrative arcs, here you're going to be seeing one that you're probably really familiar with already, and a lot of them tie into folk horror arcs. So here you could see the protagonist who's an outsider who's slowly drawn into a community and begins to understand that the rituals are far darker than they first appeared, and their fear grows as the community's comfort grows into something monstrous. Or the story could be about someone who has inherited the ritual, which means that they already belong to this community and belief system, and the reader is going to be following their struggles within this community and trying to balance what they've been taught and their morals that are telling them that this is crazy and absolutely wrong. And another type follows a zealot type of character who willingly embraces what's happening and becomes so devoted to the belief that they lose their sense of humanity. And some stories turn the actual community into the monster by using collective devotion as the true threat, which is exactly what the Wicker Man does. And one last thing that I want to say before we move on to the next one is that you want to rely on your tone and structure rather than relying on insane, shocking rituals meant to only shock your reader. Because yes, those can work, but remember, this is a person or persons that have stumbled upon something that's possibly been practiced for years or even centuries. So the rituals are going to feel slow, reverent, and practiced and carry lots of meaning and purpose because this is something sacred and possibly holy to them. So have your tribe or cult speak about the rituals and the teachings with tenderness or pride. Let the ceremony feel beautiful in its own strange way, because beauty matched with horror is what's going to truly unsettle your readers. Next, we have psychological or romantic cannibalism, and this is, yes, consumption as desire. Now, I'm sure there have been some kind of real life examples of romantic cannibalism. It's a messed up world out there, but this is more of a cannibalism that you're going to find as being used as a metaphor in literature, film, and music for all-consuming, intense, and sometimes destructive forms of love. And not literally wanting to chop up and eat your partner because you love them oh so much. But I mean, go ahead if you want to write that. It's your story. So with all that being said, this type of cannibalism is all about longing, where love becomes so overwhelming that the connection between two people feels larger than the body. And there's a love so consuming that just being close to one another doesn't feel close enough. And in its wake, instead of lashing out with brutality, the act of love becomes a strange form of tenderness. So in these stories, the urge to eat someone is really the urge to keep them forever. It's a love that doesn't want space or boundaries. It wants to fold the other person into themselves, which we can see happening perfectly in the film Bones and All. And this craving that they have is like a physical representation of saying, I want you so much that I wish I could keep every part of you with me. Essentially, it's devotion pushed to its strangest, most intimate, extreme form. Now, you might have picked up on this already, but this type of cannibalism lives in some of the darker corners of intimacy. So again, let's look at the psychology of this. So one of the strongest psychological angles you are going to be dealing with is the desire for fusion, because some people crave relationships where they want to disappear inside the other person, and the act or metaphorical act of cannibalism becomes the literal version of that fantasy. And it's going to allow your story to explore the thrill and the fear of loving someone so much that you can't tell where you end and they begin. Another psychological layer here at play is possession and permanence, because when a character wants to devour the person they love, it can tell us that they have a desire for absolute ownership over this person. And it becomes this fantasy that if they can keep this person they love inside of them, then that person can never leave. And oh my God, that sounds so toxic. But there's also an erotic charge to these types of stories, because it is romantic cannibalism after all. Just think about it. Biting, tasting, consuming, giving yourself over, all of it mirrors sexual desire, but pushes it into this dangerous place of extreme longing, where wanting someone means desiring far more than you should. And it's not always safe and gentle either. Here you'll also find stories with that beautiful disaster, aka self-destruction disguised as romance kind of love, where both of your characters know that this craving that they both have is dangerous, even fatal, but they just give into it anyways. Now, as for narrative arcs of psychological and romantic cannibalism stories, the arcs are going to be more often than not about following the simple pattern of two people who share the same frightening appetite and fall in love because they see themselves all too well in the other person. And this bond that they share becomes both their salvation and their doom. Another arc is one that revolves around one partner who wants to consume the other because they're obsessed with their partner or because they have a fear of being abandoned. And there's also some stories that focus on the merging of identities, where the act of eating someone becomes this symbolic way that they can hold them forever or keep them alive within themselves. And these types of arcs do tend to be more on the tragic gothic side, where cannibalism is more subtle and gentle, with soft moods and emotional moments that are contrasted against brutal acts. So if you're going to be writing this type of cannibalism, remember to use that mix of beauty and grotesque, because that's what's really going to give this narrative that haunting and gothic layer, if that's what you're going for. And also, if you're writing this kind of cannibalism, it really helps to focus on the emotions at play before even thinking about the actual cannibalism, whether metaphorical or literal, because remember, you're writing about longing. So spend some time exploring the fear of losing someone, the intensity of wanting them, and the intimacy of shared hunger. Another technique you can use is having sensory details that blend romantic language with unsettling imagery, like describing the taste of breath, skin, and the heartbeat of a person. And also, your character's internal conflict should take center stage here, because us as humans, we're messy, and so are your characters. So one of your characters could fear their own desires and see themselves as monstrous, or they could feel guilty about even having those desires, or feel more alive when they act on those desires, which drives their anger and hunger even further. And the last one we have is societal cannibalism, and this again is a metaphorical cannibalism, but instead of love, we're now dealing with systems like corporations, governments, capitalism, even celebrity culture can fit in here. And this type of cannibalism is essentially an entire system that chews people up and spits them out. So in these stories, the body is pretty much becoming the stage for everything that these institutions prey and feed on, like labor, attention, dignity, and autonomy. And the appetite, so to speak, is economic, political, and cultural, rather than let's chop you up and eat you. And a great example of this would be the dystopian sci-fi film Soylent Green, which is set in an overpopulated, starving, futuristic New York, where the government distributes a food product called Soylent Green. The story follows a detective who uncovers the horrifying ingredient that's been used to make this oh so popular Soylent Green, which is, yes, humans. And it's this revelation that gives us the societal cannibalism aspect, which is that the powerful are exploiting the powerless, and also shows us a world so desperate for resources that it ends up turning its people into the resources. Now, when it comes to the psychology behind societal cannibalism, what you're dealing with is a collective anxiety, because this is societal, which means that you're going to have characters that fear that they're only so useful insofar as they can be consumed, which in return turn means that these characters are going to feel trapped inside systems that they didn't design or can't stop whatsoever. And because they have that trapped feeling, it's going to trigger some psychological responses, like some characters might be so absorbed in the system that they base their value and self-worth solely on how useful they are. Other characters could go numb and just decide to drift through life because fighting back against the systems just feels pointless to them. And some could feel angry or paranoid or decide that they want to expose the truth to the world about what's actually going on. Another thing to add is that there's going to be at some point a lot of denial depending on your story, because characters are going to notice little hints, hear rumors, overhear something unsettling, and actively choose not to dig deeper into it because honestly, who wants to face the big bad? Plus, their chances of survival greatly increase when they just decide to shut up and pretend like nothing is wrong. Instead, everything is just positively splendid. And like survival cannibalism, I think that societal cannibalism can hit us hard too, because most of us know what it's like to be drained by work, overwhelmed by expectations, or treated like a resource instead of a person. And what societal cannibalism does is it turns that feeling of being used into literal body horror, because by making being consumed a real literal thing, this type of narrative is going to give your reader a sharp and quite unforgettable image of something they already understand all too well on an emotional level, which is the feeling of being worn down, used up, or erased by a system that just keeps taking and taking but never gives back. Now, when it comes to this type of arcs for societal cannibalism, one of the most popular ones that you are going to find is the whistleblower arc, which is where someone uncovers how the system really works and then they try to expose it. Another arc that you're going to find is an assimilation arc, which is where the character slowly gets absorbed or indoctrinated into the system, which sees them giving up pieces of who they are just to survive or feel like they belong in this system. And this also ties into the complicity spiral, which means that the character or characters just mindlessly go along with a system and unknowingly take part in their own destruction. And then we have an outsider arc where someone from outside the community, so this could be someone who just moved to the city, and because they're coming in with fresh eyes, that means that they can see right through everything that is going on, and they immediately start to ask questions that no one else dares to ask. But really, what shocks the outsider is that the people in this community, that the monstrous is completely normal to them and they want to keep it that way. And lastly, we have the eat or be eaten arc, where your character will reach a point where their choices shrink to two options: either join the system or get destroyed by it. Now, I didn't know if I was going to go here with this video, but I'm going here, so let's discuss the tasting notes of a human menu, shall we? So according to my research, human flesh really isn't that nutritious. Taking it in the skeletal muscle of a human, it would only yield us about 134,000 kilojoules, which means that a human could satisfy the hunger of another human for about 15 days, which is not really that much when you look at other examples like the extinct mammoth, which could keep a human alive for about 1,700 days, and a horse could last a person about 96 days. So humans not really ranking high on that nutritional scale. As for the actual taste, some accounts say that human meat tastes like veal, while others have said that it tastes like pork. But after reading more into how many men killed and sold their victims as pork, I think I am going to go with that humans taste like pork. Now, when it comes to the brain, it's said that our noggins have a rich, fatty flavor with a soft, creamy, and somewhat waxy texture that's often compared to the blend of liver and eggs. And while they are often described as tasting like eggs, especially cooked, the flavor is generally considered mild and unique, not quite like other meat. Just don't go eating brains raw, because you don't want kuru, which is a rare and fatal neurodegenerative disease which is caused by pyrons, which are infectious proteins found in the human brain tissue that eventually causes your body to break down and eventually leads to your death. So in cannibal stories, there are going to be two points of view, and I like to call them hunters and prey. So the hunter is going to be the one that is doing the eating and actively seeking people out to eat, and the prey is going to be the ones being eaten, so the victim. So let's look at these two. First, we have hunters, and there's going to be two types of groups that are going to fall under this category. So, first, we have one or two people that get the idea that they want to eat someone and set out to do so. And second is a group of people like a cult or a tribe that uses cannibalism as a form of ritual and therefore set out to find someone for said ritual. So, hunters are driven by appetite, their belief, and they 100% believe that what they are doing is right and okay. These aren't characters that wake up thinking that they're bad people, because in their minds, every action that they make is necessary, earned, or even sacred. And hunters aren't full-blown maniacs with a hunger for human flesh from the get-go, but rather they ease themselves into it step by step, convincing themselves that each shift in their behavior is harmless. And before long, the forbidden starts to feel familiar, and the familiar starts to feel dull. And that's when the trouble starts. So when we're looking at the psychology of a hunter character, a lone hunter is basically going to be someone who's growing their obsession in the dark, and it grows the most when no one's looking. But a group of hunters is a little bit different, because now we're seeing how people can change when they share the same beliefs and habits and start egging each other's worst impulses on. And when everyone's responsible, no one really feels responsible, and that eases their guilt and makes making dangerous choices a lot easier to do. And pretty soon, we shouldn't turns into we did. As for a hunter's arc, it is usually going to start with desire. So desire could stem from curiosity or hunger, or even from ideology. But whatever it is, once they cross that threshold, they don't go back. Their path only moves in one direction, which is straight towards consumption inevitability. And when it comes time to close the book on their story, it usually ends in one or two extremes, which is that they reach some kind of twisted and messed up fulfillment, like a ritual happens, or they finally cook someone up, or they collapse under the weight of the monstrosity that they become, which could be that they're caught, can't live with themselves, or they just go mad. And then we have the prey character, and I say that within cannibal stories, these are going to be your most popular protagonists. So a major theme with prey characters is erosion and dehumanization, because when you think about it, what makes these characters themselves, like their personality, their wants, dislikes, talents, and so forth, are being taken away from them, and they're being reduced to a food source. And one thing to note here is that these characters shouldn't be portrayed as weak, because they aren't weak. They're just trapped in a situation where the pressure is quickly tightening around them, which means that they could be surrounded, cornered, outnumbered by a tribe, cult, or a single person, or they could be slowly worn down until they feel themselves slipping out of their own life. And the best way to show this erosion and dehumanization is by sending them through an unraveling arc, which starts with uncertainty. So this means that everything in the world is a-okay and normal. Then we slip into disbelief, which is where little cracks start to show up and things stop making sense. Then dread settles in once those cracks widen and they realize what's actually going on. Then comes the acceptance stage, where they reason with the fact that they might just become dinner, or they get that final burst of fight and decide to fight back against the cannibals. But the most important thing here is that you have your prey character or characters break down emotionally and mentally before anything dangerous actually happens to them, because it's going to make what's going to come just that much more devastating, because they've been psychologically rewritten. As for their ending, some will escape, some will transform, and others won't make it out because they've landed on the menu. Yum. So that, dear horror writer, concludes our feast into the world of cannibalism. If you enjoyed your meal here at the Horror Scriptorium, then please give us a like. It'll make the ghouls very happy to know that you've enjoyed their cooking. But if you want to enjoy another meal from the Horror Scriptorium, but in the comfort of your own dungeon, then don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on our newest dishes. So until next time, bye-bye.